Welcome to Lawline with your host, Alan Storman. Mr. Storman is a distinguished trial attorney, author, and lecturer. Each week, Lawline will bring you the most knowledgeable experts in the field of law today. And now, we introduce our guests and our host, Alan Storman.
Welcome to Lawline. It has become a common occurrence to see the same cases tried in both criminal and civil court. This is especially true in police brutality cases where the city has ended up paying millions of dollars in awards to victims of police violence. Today we'll look at the impact these monetary settlements have had on the police department and the public at large. Our guests are the Honorable Douglas McKeon, Justice of the Supreme Court, Bronx County, and Susan Carton, who represented the family of Anthony Baez, who was killed by the police officer. Hello, Judge. Hello, Susan.
Hi, Alan.
Alan, nice to be back with you.
Well, always a pleasure, Judge. Judge, are you finding police brutality cases on the rise in the city?
We seem to have more filed. We seem to have more lawyers bringing them. I don't know what that signifies, Alan, with respect to whether the instances of police brutality are on the rise, but certainly juries are making significant awards, and these are cases that the city is taking quite seriously.
Now, Susan, I know you settled the Anthony Baez case, I think, for $3 million, the largest assault settlement against the city of New York.
The largest wrongful death settlement ever that the city paid in a police brutality case. And it was very important that it be a record settlement because it was a record-breaking case. In many respects, Judge McKeon presided over that case. And I believe that there have been certain changes made in the police department as a result of the way this case was litigated.
But, Judge, didn't the city take a position on that case that, yes, assuming everything happened as Ms. Carton said it happened, but the man acted without the scope of his authority? We never gave him that authority. He wasn't working for us when he did those acts.
Well, they did make that argument, and I rejected it as a matter of law, Alan. I said that this man was in uniform, and I described the events that evening leading up to Anthony Baez's death as a police enterprise. In other words, this was a police action. Lavoti was not alone on a street corner somewhere off-duty. He was in uniform. There was a sergeant there. Other police were summoned, and this was a full-scale police operation when the acts that gave rise to young Anthony's death occurred. And I ruled that he was in the scope of employment. Even if he did some of his acts not exactly by the rule book, he was in furtherance of police work when he was doing them.
And that decision will have a great effect on other police brutality cases that are brought in this city, particularly the Louima case now that will be coming up, and the defense that was put forward. We always said it was a bogus defense, but it really, the judge's decision now put to rest this whole issue of police officers who brutalize citizens in our city, and then the city claims that they have no responsibility for their actions. Well, that now has been put to rest with Judge McKeon's decision. They do have responsibility of the city, particularly in those circumstances where it's a police action or a police enterprise, as the judge said.
Judge, what is the police department doing, if you know, to prevent this from happening in the future? Nobody wants this to happen.
Well, I think the police department's view of it is that these are isolated instances, Alan. I think they take the position that many of these claims are unjustified, that many of these claims represent lawyers trying to cash in on a view held in certain communities, which is a skeptical view of police, and that they settle these cases more as a defensive matter. They'll tell you about these 1983 federal statute cases in which attorney's fees are awarded to lawyers, and very often they say there's some problem, we're dealing with it, our officers are better trained, better educated today, and that Lavoti represents an isolated instance.
Susan, when does it become where a police officer is arresting a particular subject, and when does it become, well, I had to do all those things to gain control over the defendant and to police brutality? Where is that line?
Well, the line is with regard to what basically is happening. In the Lavoti case, which I use as an example, basically you had 4 brothers outside on the street playing football, and that ended in a confrontation where Anthony Baez was killed. because basically he said, why are we being arrested for playing football in front of our home? And when he confronted Lavoti with that, Lavoti came back and exercised his authority by putting him in a chokehold. And this is the problem. More and more we're seeing in the initiative of the mayor with regard to execute, the quality of life crimes, having cops on the street involved in quality of life arrests, where you come upon people who are basically just asking, why am I being arrested, or asking very non-confrontational situations. A situation gets out of control, and before we know it, a citizen is arrested for no reason and is brutalized.
Now, Lavoti was tried on the criminal charges.
Correct,
right here
in the Bronx.
And he was acquitted.
Yes, he was, before Judge Scheinlin.
Now, I understand he was tried on different charges?
He was then tried in a federal court under federal civil rights charges, which is very different from the charge that he faced in the Bronx criminal court. That was for criminal negligent homicide. And a police officer who is acting under the color of law, if he violates somebody's civil rights, the federal government can step in and prosecute a police officer for whatever rights were violated. In this case, it was Anthony's death that occurred as a result of those violations. And so when the acquittal took place in the Bronx, which everybody in the city was up in arms about, the federal government then stepped in, Mary Jo White's office, and said, now we are going to prosecute Officer Lavoti for a different charge in a different court under a different standard of proof. And it was in that court that he was finally convicted and ended up getting 7 years in jail.
But was that for the same event?
It was basically for the same event, but for a different charge.
With Anthony Byers'
Correct.
death?
Yes, it was, but it was a federal civil rights violation.
They didn't try him for a killing, but I think...
They tried him for assault.
For assault.
Explain to us, Judge, how that can happen, how a defendant can lose in the state court.
Correct.
And be charged for the same crime but different charges in a federal court, and yet be convicted in a federal court.
Well, I mean, our
double
courts,
jeopardy.
Well, there are some who make that rather compelling argument, and I must tell you, Alan, I think there's some basis to that. However, our courts have ruled that these federal civil rights statutes are separate and apart, do not constitute double jeopardy. We saw the same kind of a scenario in Simi Valley with the police out there. I think out in Brooklyn with the regrettable killings in Crown Heights. Ultimately, those convictions were gathered.
Yusuf Hawkins.
Yusuf Hawkins was accomplished under the same principle, even though he was acquitted in the state court, he was retried in the federal court. And the reality is, whether you want to characterize it as a civil rights claim or not, the same underlying acts are the subject of these cases. But again, I believe that our high courts have spoken to this and have said that it doesn't constitute double jeopardy.
And Alan, in the Lavoti case, which was a very compelling factor, you had a Judge Scheinlin, say there was a nest of perjury in the courtroom. Even though he acquitted Lavoti, he did say there was a nest of perjury. And one of the problems that we had in that case was, I believe the acquittal took place because the police officers who testified there perjured themselves. So there really was a very strong outcry by the federal government to come in and right a wrong that had taken place in the Supreme Court in the Bronx County.
I think the criticism, however, Alan, of the dual trials is that these are political decisions, that these are controversial kinds of cases that the media or the public doesn't like the initial result of, and then they're retried in another forum.
Second bite of the apple?
Exactly. That the same thing happens on and on and on throughout the country in cases that are not high profile, and a criminal defendant walks away and never faces the federal court. And I think there's some basis for that particular criticism. Although I must say, to give credit to Sue Carton, she was relentless in getting the federal prosecutors to take a look at what happened that night. And she was very, very aggressive in the civil case in developing leads that I think ultimately led to the conviction of Lavoti.
But let's go into, why do you think this is happening in the city of New York? Do you find this, is it racially based? What is your take on this?
No, I don't think it's racially based, because I think we're seeing, and certainly the kinds of cases that are coming into my office are across all racial lines and across all ethnic lines. I think there is a great initiative by the mayor in the city to have aggressive policing and a mentality of the means justify the ends. So that if we have a low crime rate, even if we brutalize people or we have cops that aren't trained properly to deal with people respectfully, the means and the ends here outweigh what happens in the meantime.
Susan, you tell me this is a political issue coming right from the top?
Oh, I think so. I think Commissioner Safer and Mayor Mayor Giuliani are on the same page here. I think that there is a definite approach by the mayor in these cases. I think it's been criticized by many people that initially when these incidents happen, the first thing that happens is the mayor gets on TV and says we have to give the benefit of doubt to the cops, and even in the Lavoti case, which was really pretty clear cut right from the beginning what happened, he initially blamed the Baez family, and it wasn't until he heard the evidence in the criminal case and then the police departmental trial which took place, we had that he called Mrs. Baez, she didn't take his call, and said, I apologize. And I think this is a problem. I think that the police department is receiving its messages from Mayor Giuliani.
I think in fairness, Alan, I think the general public views police differently than they did 20 years ago. And I think there are juries in certain venues who are prepared to give significant awards to people who claim they were victimized by the police. And as a result of that, the lawyers, the trial lawyers, such as yourself and Sue Carton, are more apt to accept these cases and take them and see them through the courts. And we know that years ago, it was rare to see a police officer of the city answerable in damages for the actions of a cop. The jurors in New York City 25 years ago viewed the police as God. I can remember back in the 60s when there was a referendum for a civilian complaint review board. It overwhelmingly was defeated. Today, the philosophy, the point of view is different. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that.
But that has come about because every other day on the news we see another incident happening, and people become desensitized to the fact that police officers, like doctors years ago, you couldn't sue them because they were considered God. That is no longer the fact before a jury.
Yes,
when a New York City police officer takes the stand, is there a credibility problem?
Absolutely. In Bronx County there is.
And I think in other
understand it to be
counties
in
too.
Kings County. I think generally people do not hold them on the same pedestal as once they were viewed. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. You see the instances in the last number of years, the O.J. Simpson case with Furman, the Lavoti situation. These are now publicized cases, and people are looking at the police, whether fairly or unfairly, somewhat differently.
Do you feel when a police officer takes a stand that on any type of case, whether it's a police brutality case or a gun case, are they prepared properly? Do they know the evidence? I mean, what have you found?
I found that there is a lot of credibility issues in terms of what police officers say, even in a simple accident case. And you know, I've had a lot of police officers on the stand in regular motor vehicle cases, and I've had an excellent relationship with them. And then you find that when you put them in the police brutality situations, the mindset changes drastically.
You know, Alan, in fairness, if somebody acts up in my courtroom and is disrespectful, and I hold a person in contempt, Alan Schnurman and Sue Carton are going to applaud my actions because the courtroom is sacrosanct and it has to be kept in a dignified way. Now, if somebody answers a police officer on a street corner back and is disrespectful and uses profanity, the officer is placed in a real difficult situation. If he overreacts, he's going to be criticized. If he does nothing, then his authority means absolutely nothing. And these are the types of circumstances that exist today.
Judge, let me just ask you this. What is a no-knock search?
Well, they just come in without a search warrant, as I understand, without any warning at all.
No.
Can they do that?
Well, the no-knock search warrant cases, the ones that we have, are situations where they have gotten information from a confidential informant. And based on that, they execute a warrant from this person, usually somebody that's not a great standing member of our society who wants to make a deal with the police and says, you know, you go to that apartment, you'll find drugs.
I mean a criminal himself?
Yes.
Okay.
And so based on that, they go before a judge. They put a detective puts a piece of paper before a judge. There's no hearing. The judge doesn't have to find out if this confidential informant is credible. Signs off on it.
The judge assumes
that
the credibility
because the police officer says that basically by putting that document before the judge.
Okay.
And then the next thing, that document is taken and somebody's house is broken into as a result of that warrant.
So now, I could be in home with my bed and my family, my children in their bedrooms, and all of a sudden the door comes flying down, And then what happened?
And a search takes place, usually for drugs. Now, what we have seen in the last year, there are a number of cases, and the newspaper has been writing about them. There are these cases where a search is executed based on these kinds of informants, and when the police get there, they get either to the wrong address, the wrong apartment, or the people have nothing to do with drugs. And so that there is a constitutional problem with the way the whole search goes down, and then people are abused, their houses are ripped apart, and the police basically say, I'm sorry, and they walk away. And even in the face, this is what's so outrageous, even in the face of having the wrong address, we have cases where there's the wrong address, the wrong apartment, Commissioner Safer has still gone publicly and said, we were right to be there.
Well, you know, Alan, historically, in order to seek damages against the city of New York for such actions, one had to show a lack of probable cause or a lack of reasonableness. Usually that's overcome by showing that the neutral magistrate has approved the search.
Right.
And that's creating a whole body of new case law that's being dealt with.
We'll continue with this conversation right after this break. You're watching Lawline. I'm Alan Schnorman, your host. Stay with us.
Give someone they don't know a gift. They do it because this gift saves lives. And the need for it is desperate. We need over 20,000 people to give this precious gift every day. Please give blood. There's a life to be saved right now. Call the American Red Cross at 1-800-GIVE-LIFE.
Hello, you're watching Lawline. I'm Alan Schnorman, your host. Today we're talking about lawsuits against New York City for police brutality. With us is Judge Douglas McKeon, Supreme Court Judge. Bronx County is Susan Carton, who represented the Lavoti family. Not the Baez
family,
against
not the Lavoti family.
Oh my God, what an error I made. But Judge, let me ask you this. Cases now against the City of New York.
Yes.
I had heard in Supreme Court, in civil court. There's been a movement afoot to bring these cases in a special court, a court of claims for the city. What's your opinion on that?
Well, the city would like to see that. They'd like a situation where there would be non-jury trials, that a judge would decide these cases, and historically we know the state of New York has that kind of situation. And while I must say there have been some court of claims judges who've done good work as far as giving reasonable amounts for certain kinds of circumstances, I think as a historical proposition, generally speaking, the municipalities do better in before a judge rather than a jury. I personally think that the system now should remain as is. We should perhaps add more judges. We should now deal with the burgeoning caseload that the city confronts as a court system, but I don't think that the citizenry should be asked to give up a jury trial.
Susan, if you could have the ear of the legislature, how would you handle the cases against the city any differently in the future?
You mean with regard to the court, to having a special court where people's rights to a jury are taken away from them?
More judges, quicker calendars.
I think that there's a lot of room for early disposition of cases against the city at an early point in
How
time.
long does it take in your county, Judge, for a case to come to trial against the city?
I was told only yesterday that one case remained on the beyond standards and goals for in excess of a year, almost 2 years. Many
means
years.
what? Which means
Well,
what? From the day a case starts.
Case starts, lawyers do discovery in that case. They say that the case is hypothetically ready to be tried, and it's put on a court calendar, and there, today, it can languish for as long as 3 years. I think there's a lot of things we can do, Ellen, and I think that we treat cases as one broad category. In the Bronx, I implemented a special system in which we would deal with these trip and fall cases in a unique way, in an expedited way, because my view was if somebody falls on the sidewalk, shouldn't be treated the same way as a Lavoti-Baez case.
Susan, if there's a New York City police officer who's sitting watching this program out there, and he works every day, and as we all agree, the vast majority do the best possible job they can, what's your advice to that particular officer?
I think that it's important that police officers respect the citizenry. They work for us, basically. We pay them. And I also think it's important that when you see something wrong, and I'm not saying it happens all the time, but if you see something wrong with your partner or some brutality takes place, that the normal blue wall of silence that normally comes up in these situations should not come up. And I give credit to those police officers who have the courage to stand up and say it when they see something happen that's wrong. And that's the only way this is going to change, because it's a culture, Alan. There's a culture, and I understand why this happens, because you have a partner and yourself, and you have to be, that person is watching your back all the time on the street. But when something happens that's wrong and that it shouldn't take place, and it's important for police officers to stand up and say so. And that's the only way we're going to root out police corruption.
Well, on the other hand, Alan, we don't want to send a signal to police officers that they're better turning away and not getting involved. And that's what I'm afraid of. I think today we have a tendency to replay the actions of a police officer with the benefit of hindsight. They have to make split decisions. And it's a rough community out there. And unfortunately, what I think we are inviting is the concept that officers can look the other way and not get involved when we'd like a police officer being involved.
Yeah, but I think it's important when police officers see something that's not right to speak up, and that changes a lot of the attitude of police officers.
So the bad apples should be rooted out. But the truth of the matter is that today we have a different philosophy and a different climate. I think there's been a report by the Civil Liberties Union criticizing the CCRB. You know,
What's the CCRB?
Well, it's the Civilian Complaint Review Board in New York City. And frankly, that's used as a weapon by wrongdoers as well. Somebody gets arrested, somebody has something to do with a police officer, they say the police officer didn't act very properly, they file a complaint. So, I mean, it's a very difficult subject, Ellen. There's a lot to be said on both sides.
But that's an important issue, because basically what everybody feels who's doing work in this area is that the CCRB is completely ineffectual, and there is no police, there's nobody policing the police.
Judge, I want, if you could talk to the police officers out there, what line should they not cross? When does it become acceptable behavior on their part, and when is it unacceptable?
I think if in doubt, you have to assume it's unacceptable, because what you have today are administrative tribunals, juries, courts, replaying in slow motion things that occurred in a matter of split seconds, and now they're the subject of 2- and 3-week trials. And quite frankly, in certain venues, Alan, the police are just not viewed in a very sympathetic way, and a police officer who perhaps acted appropriately has his actions reviewed and dissected in so many different ways that, if in doubt, I think take the cautious way out.
But there are very specific rules within the police department that tell police officers what they can't do and what they can do. And for instance, there was a rule saying that you can't choke somebody. The chokeholds are prohibited. You can't stick something up somebody's rectum. I mean, these are things that are you know, you can't slap somebody because they're playing stickball. No, but yesterday we heard about somebody playing stickball, and a police officer came over and said, "Get off the street," and slapped the kid across the face. You know, this is unacceptably behaved. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to know what's acceptable and what's not acceptable.
Nobody wants to see brutal cops on the street, Alan, and believe me, I handled the part in which I dealt with a lot of these cases. On the other hand, some of these police officers are confronting criminals who are big in stature, physically speaking. They have to deal with them, they have to restrain them, and you know, it's easy for us to sit here in a studio and say how it ought to be done by the book. They're out on the street.
And in dangerous streets.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, Susan, if you had to give your advice to the public and the police, what would be your last-minute advice?
My advice is to respect the police, and my advice to the citizenry is to respect the police, as well as the police officers respecting the citizenry. There is no reason to react to certain situations. These are trained professionals who are paid to react in certain ways and know better than the average person how to treat one another, and they shouldn't be slapping individuals. They shouldn't be taking advantage of situations where they can talk down a situation and not escalate it into a confrontation. We all will have a better rapport with the police and more respect, and ultimately it's situations like Baez and the Louima case that undermine the public's respect for police officers and does a lot of damage, so that these persons who are bad apples cause a great deal of disrespect for the entire police department.
Your Honor?
Alan, we have a lot of fine police officers out there, and Susan is absolutely right. It's a small percentage of them, and we see the same characters coming back over and over again as being involved in these kind of instances. And unfortunately, probably we don't have a process in place here in this city to deal with that situation as readily as it should be.
But how do we, the key element is the millions of dollars that the city is paying out now.
Yes.
How does that bring to a stop? How do you...
Well, Mrs. Baez had an interesting proposition. She said that instead of the city paying, the police officers be fined a certain amount who are found to be brutal, and that money comes out of their pocket, a certain amount of it. I don't know that it's realistic, but it's something that we ought to consider when a police officer is hit in the pocket. And one of the things, Alan, that's important for the public to realize, that in a lot of these cases, these police officers had numerous complaints filed against them before it ever got to a lawsuit. And so the city has been on notice that they have a cop who is been having problems with excessive force. Lavoti had 15 complaints against him. He was in a special force monitoring program. He had been recommended to be removed from the 46th precinct by the commanding officer, and they did nothing. And that's why the city of New York paid.
And the police officers who are in the same situation, who have complaints against them, say, listen, they're nothing more than complaints. I'm a good cop. When I see somebody being accosted, I get in there and I do what I'm supposed to do. I don't hide in the squad car. And when you're that kind of a cop, you're going to get complaints, because I'm dealing not with the best of society. And the complaints have to be viewed as either they've been substantiated or not. So I know where Susan is coming from, and she has a point. On the other hand, I think that a lot of these complaints are made, Alan. A lot of people who make them don't follow up on them, and really should a police officer be tarred and feathered with an unsubstantiated complaint? There's a matter of fundamental fairness too.
If a person feels that the police have overreacted, if they assaulted them, if they were brutal with them, is there a number from the police department to call to complain?
No, and I wouldn't recommend that they call the police department to complain about a situation with the police. The reality is there's no one to call.
Yeah.
The reality is there's no one to call, Alan, because the CCRB does nothing. And we know of situations where the CCRB has complaints there for the last 2 years and has done nothing.
Isn't there a Department of Internal Affairs that supervises all the actions?
There supposedly is, but if you go into these situations, we find that the investigations are not really done with the interests of the citizen. They're done with the protection of the police officer, and I don't recommend that any client call up the New York City Police Department to complain about a particular police officer.
You know, Alan, this is true in all facets of life. You have lawyers like Alan Schnurman and Sue Carton who say, well, there are judges who don't aggressively try to settle my case. And then you get a judge who does aggressively try to settle, and maybe somebody complains about him or her, saying, well, that judge is too aggressive. And it's true with police officers as well. Some have a view of the job, and if it's not in keeping with what we want of our police officers, yes, something should be done about it. But there are tribunals who do look into these things. The commissioner has the final word as far as discipline, and that's where I think Susan has a beef, that many times these complaints are reported and they're not disciplined and nothing happens.
And with that, thank you very much, both of you, for appearing on
having us.
Lawline. Judge Douglas McKean, Supreme Court, Bronx
Thank you.
County.
Thank you.
Susan Carton, thank you again for appearing on Lawline. And as always, this is Alan Schnurman, and thank you for watching Lawline.
You have been watching Lawline with your host, New York trial attorney Alan Schnurman. Mr. Schnurman will be back with you next week at the same time. If you have any questions about this week's program, please write to Lawline, 63 Wall Street, New York, New York, 10005, or call area area code 212-432-9111.